Pakistan's main issue has been its inability to produce anything of value for the rest of the world. That in turn is connected to our political issue, namely that our ruling bloc, our ruling elite, specifically the military establishment, has been interested in promoting the interests of one particular sector. And that sector, as we know, does not export anything to the rest of the world while it imports stuff from the rest of the world, right? So real estate and construction will add to the, all the problems, the complex problems that we have in innumerable.
Even the disruptions that we see that are happening in Pakistan at the moment, I don't think they are going to lead to any changes in status quo, because you pointed out that despite regardless whosoever is in power, whether that's PDM, whether that's PDI, whether that's the military dictatorship, they're all governed by one set of power brokers and the land mafias, which dictate the economic environment of Pakistan as well.
I would say that particular institutional structure has led to the economic crisis because it leads to redistribution of resources from bottom to top. Like in the case of, for example, land economy, small peasants or landless peasants have been displaced, right? And that land has been used for real estate speculation, right? Now in Pakistani media, after a while, now you can talk about generals and judges, right? You can name them, Chief Justice, Army Chief, but at least what I noticed in the mainstream media, name of the real estate developer, Malik Riaz, is muted, while the name of Army Chief and Chief Justice is not muted these days, right?
It boiled up. So rather than producing goods, a lot of business makers in Pakistan, it was feasible for them to import goods from, let's say, China and sell them in Pakistan because imported goods were costing them less. So it is not that while there was growth happening, the growth was not being led by the production scale, upscale production or integration of Pakistani, mid-tier, periphery, third-tier companies with global value chains. So the integration was not there. The structural transformation wasn't happening. The focus was still back then completely on real estate. Malik Riaz was still the tycoon. He still is.
On the one hand, the military's constituency is no longer within the control of the military top brass, right? And on the other hand, the international kind of coalition of interests, because of Pakistan's economic situation, right? You see, political sovereignty is a casualty of economic volatility, right? When you're running out of funds, default should not be an option.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Nauraiz Rana, and I'm an economist for the World Bank. I'll be hosting today's program on New Wave, where we'll be discussing the economic trajectory of Pakistan, especially in light of the political instability that has shaped over the last few days and so. Then we will be talking about some of the structural issues and deficiencies and what is the way to recovery. Is there a possibility? Is there a short-term solution? Or, we just have to wait and go through the upheavals as the economy revives. And, the question whether it revives also depends on if it will revive. Because, there's lots of issues which are not just economic in nature, they're social, they're development-oriented, they're political, and we need to kind of unpack all of them and chart out a plan which focuses on each one of them individually and cumulatively as well. So to discuss this topic, I have two very special guests, two economists who also happen to be professors of economy. I'll first introduce Professor Danish Khan. He's an assistant professor at Franklin and Marshall College. He has previously worked at the Asian Development Bank and with the Planning Commission of Pakistan as well. So welcome, Danish. It's great to have you today.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. Our second very special guest is Dr. Shahram Azhar. He's assistant professor of economy and he teaches at the Bucknell University. Previously, he's taught in Pakistan at Habib University as well. And, both Danish and Shahram, I'm very glad to have you. And I'm sure, there's a depth of knowledge. There's an entire goldmine of, economic opinions that you may have based on evidence, based on data, based on your experience. And I'm sure, we can have some key takeaways after, during the course and at the end of the discussion. So without further ado, I'll begin the discussion. When we had planned, we had scheduled this discussion amongst ourselves, as you both know, it was a while ago. And, the political scenario in Pakistan was quite different than what it is. And, especially how it has shaped in the last 10 days. There's complete chaos. It's borderline anarchy. Things erupted since Imran Khan got arrested. And I think we'll be doing an injustice if we ignore all of that and only focus on the economic issues because, these things do not happen in isolation. They never happen in silos. And what we are witnessing in Pakistan, there's some people label that it's a very serious and a severe threat to social cohesion, and things can go downhill as they have been spiraling over the last 10 days. But what we see is, I personally feel, I don't think it's just political in nature. The outburst, the anger, it's a culmination of various feelings and emotions that people have been going through, witnessing over the last 1 year or so. And I think a lot of that has got to do with the economic oppression, the economic suffering that people have been subjected to. And I have a few numbers in front of me, which if you look at food inflation is a huge indicator. So last year in April 2022, food inflation was 17.26%. This year, based on the state bank's figures, food inflation stands at 48.07%. So that is unprecedented. The value of currency, it has depreciated 46% since last year. So last year in May 2022, compared to now, the economy has completely dissipated. And the effects, there are multiple effects. Our inflation is linked to the value of a currency because we're an import-oriented economy. We don't even have enough to finance our raw materials. And the impacts are being directly felt by the common man. And they are exponentially more greatly felt by low-income households who are already bordering poverty. So what do you think, where are we headed? The political situation boiling up, the economy is already in a downward spiral. So, first, Danish, let's hear it from you. Where do you think, where are we headed?
I think it's a difficult question to just explain it in like a few minutes. So, because there's so many underlying factors, right? So, I'll try. So, I mean, food insecurity, unemployment, chronic underemployment, they have been there for like past 5 years. I mean, even prior to that. So remember, 2012 was also a very bottom in many ways. There was economy was halted due to massive power outages. There was lots of violent terrorist attacks. Economy was overall the sentiment for investments or business or consumer confidence was low, right? And then all of a sudden, like in a couple of years, it did pick up and there was some sort of a positive trajectory from 2013 onwards, right? And then it halted again in 2017 with the ouster of Nawaz Sharif, right, through Supreme Court. So, and then from there on, so that's why I wanted to, again, it's not a long arc, but it's at least we should take a slightly longer view of these events, right? And since 2018, there has been an economic slowdown. In 2017, growth rate was around 6%, then it went down to less than 1%. But the key issue has been, right, whenever there are periods of economic growth in Pakistan, they are followed by economic downturns, right? And maybe we can talk about this in next section, why you briefly mentioned because of the reliance on exports, right? So our consumption is heavily dependent on imports. So, but coming back to your point about current scenario, so political instability has been the key constant in Pakistan throughout, right? Except periods of military dictatorship where through some sort of coercive measure, that stability has been created. And again, that political settlement also gets challenged based on multiple factors, global, but also domestic factors, which leads to political parties getting together and getting rid of the military dictators. Now, this time it's a unique factor because it's there's a coalition government, right, of 13 parties, which in some ways can lead to stability because it represents broader consensus in the society. But one major political actor is out, right? And that political actor, PTI, is willing to do anything to get back into power, right? And again, and we cannot just argue that this is only with PTI. Other political actors have been doing that in past. And therefore, we see this massive outburst, but we don't have data from the ground to really say whether it's the which socioeconomic groups are participating in these rallies. It seems like it's more of the affluent middle income segments, at least from urban centers, right? But again, it will be based on anecdotes. We don't have concrete data. But I would argue, maybe that sounds counterintuitive, that because of so much food inflation, unemployment, and other economic crises, average or ordinary citizens are kind of alienated in this process, right? They probably want change, right? And that change at times is in the form of PTI, but at other times it's the PDM. If you remember, before the ouster of Imran, the PDM had this economic package that inflation is the issue, unemployment is the issue. So ordinary citizens did give them chance. But I think this current crisis, we cannot explain it primarily through economic lens, that people are in the streets because of the economic stress that they are facing. I mean, that stress is there, but I'm not saying that the political expression captures that. It seems more like a more ideological expression of core PTI base. That's why we didn't see millions in the streets, right? I mean, I don't know if but yeah. Okay.
No, obviously that's a very fair point. And I mean, like you said, we don't have the data, we don't have the evidence to claim anything, but it could be one of the many reasons. But what we do have is some figures where we can compare, the accounts, the value of currency before and after, the value of external debt before and after. But not to say that things were well, even while Imran Khan was in power. And I need to give that disclaimer that things have been for a while, they've been on a downwards trajectory. If you compare the 2022 numbers, March 2022, let's say, for instance, the month before Imran Khan was ousted, with the numbers of March 2021, then we'll see a significant increase in inflation even then. And Pakistan was, he gave the oil subsidy was accorded by Imran Khan, which actually accelerated the pace at which the foreign reserves began depleting. So that was one of the triggers to the entire economic conundrum that we are facing. So it has been in the creation, in the construction for a while, and not to absolve any one party from the other, but just linking the social crisis with the economic crisis. And we've seen that in other parts of the world. Sri Lanka very recently, there was a default scenario, and then people just revolted against the status quo that existed over there. At some point, and what is more threatening and scary to say so is the fact that if a country like Pakistan defaults, when people, at the moment they're struggling, but once it's beyond the point of struggle where they actually do not have enough to put food on the table for their next meal for their kids, then you see a social uprising. And it may not be targeted towards one particular party or the other. It's just an expression of utter injustice that the people have been subjected to. And I guess PTI, just because it's not in power at the moment, it's in the opposition, it has the ability to kind of capture that narrative and rally the entire population. But now coming back to Shahram, actually, what I wanted to discuss, ask you that, where do you see these economic deceivers end? Like, what is the rock bottom? The inflation is already at 48%. The currency has lost 46% of its value. Where do we end? Do we end at where Lebanon is? Do we end at where Sri Lanka is? Is default imminent? If default happens, what does that even mean? Because a lot of people, they tend to speak about default, but they don't really understand the implications. So, here I would really want you to come in and elaborate.
Right. Before I totally agree with what Danish said and what you also argued in your earlier remarks. I just want to kind of set the stage for, how I'm looking at this particular issue, right? Kind of set the context. You see, no country in the world has or can indefinitely survive on other people's savings, right? That's the bottom line, right? No country in the world. We've known this fact pretty much since the time of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, right? Countries that succeed, the wealth of nations, as Adam Smith told us in 1776, depends on what you produce, right? And what you can sell to the rest of the world. So, I mean, you can ask this question about any kind of country in the world, right? Let's ask the following question. What does, for example, Pakistan contribute to the world capitalist system, right? So, for example, Taiwan contributes the manufacturing of semiconductors, that part of the value chain. Vietnam is capturing the market share of even Chinese companies now in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, right? India, as we know, Tim Cook and Apple recently visited India, and I mean, it's kind of ironic that the #1 company CEO in the world is getting selfies taken with the naked sadhus. But that's the logic of global capital, right? You have to provide something to the world system so that some part of the global value that's being produced in the world is captured in your territory as well, aka the GDP, right? So we have to produce something, and we have to produce something that is of utility to the rest of the world. Bottom line, that's the bottom line, right? If you do not produce anything of value for anyone else, no one is going to buy your goods and services. It follows that, in this world of where, value is crossing boundaries, it follows that all of these outcomes that we're describing, for example, exchange rate depreciation, currency depreciation, right? Why is Vietnam's currency not depreciating right now, right? Why is India's currency within this narrower band? There has been depreciation in USD terms related to the increase in interest rates in the US, etc. It's a global phenomenon. But why is Pakistan's situation much worse even than its regional, competitors or similar economies? Yeah. That's the key question to ask, right? So the first question I want to point out is, what do we produce of value to the world system? Now, this economic question, once you start asking it, you can ask the next question, which is, what do we produce? What does Pakistan's investment structure look like, right? So it follows, anyone who's looked at the numbers can tell you that the #1 asset that draws the attention of investors in Pakistan is, at least for the last 3 decades, the real estate sector, right? Now, you're an economist, right? And we have this nerdy and fancy language to explain this. We distinguish between tradables and non-tradables. That's just a fancy way of saying what can be sold to the rest of the world and what has to be consumed internally within the market. And the traditional example we learned in textbooks is that of the haircut, right? That even if there's a free haircut in Indonesia somewhere, I won't go right now to get that haircut. It's a non-tradable commodity, right? So now let's ask this question. What are the sectors that have grown in profitability in Pakistan? Where are the capital gains, right? Because in a capitalist economy, investors and investments will follow expected rates of returns, right? And expected rates of returns are not just created in abstraction from policy. Rents are generated through state policy and activity, right? So for example, it is not a coincidence that Vietnam suddenly produces Nike's shoes, right? Or it's not a coincidence that Modi is meeting Tim Cook and guaranteeing certain things, right? So it follows that Pakistan's main issue has been its inability to produce anything of value for the rest of the world. That in turn is connected to our political issue, namely that our ruling bloc, our ruling elite, specifically the military establishment, has been interested in promoting the interests of one particular sector. And that sector, as we know, does not export anything to the rest of the world while it imports stuff from the rest of the world, right? So real estate and construction will add to the all the problems, the complex problems that we have in numerous ways. In another way, for example, you mentioned the issue of food production, right? And food inflation. Yeah, sochne ki baat hai, why is it the case that agrarian economy, I mean, I grew up believing that Pakistan is a agrarian country, right? Everything we do is for our farmers and all the rest of it, that great ideology we learned growing up, right? So the question is, well, land is a scarce asset, and land use, Danish and I wrote about this recently, land use, like any asset, can be used for multiple, different uses, right? It can be used to build shadi halls for people, right? It can be used to, build sports complexes for kids. It can be used for a host of reasons. It can be used to make food above all else, right? So the question of food scarcity in Pakistan is also tied with the interests of the real estate sector. It has to do with land use policies that go back to the year 2001, when Pervez Musharraf, the former dictator, enacted a series of land use related reforms. Okay, so then what I'm trying to argue then is that all of these questions are interrelated. The effects might be disparate, but the causes are identical, and it all ultimately boils down to the issue of the institutional structure, right? We know from Darren Acemoglu, for example, that the question of economic success and economic development ultimately boils down to the structure of your institutions and the quality of your institutions. Specifically, two kinds of institutions: economic institutions, those that pertain to the distribution of resources in a society, and political institutions, those that pertain to the distribution of power. Now, within that particular, the latter kind of institutions, that's where the disjuncture is in the Pakistani state. And my biggest fear right now, if I'm perfectly honest, is that for the first time, I feel that the ruling bloc, the historical ruling bloc, as Gramsci called it, for the first time, the military and the military constituency in particular, for me, it's not about individuals, it's about constituencies. There is a pro-establishment constituency in Pakistan, period. Some of them reside in cantonment, some of them reside elsewhere. They're a part of our, social milieu, right? But the point is, the most frightening bit is that for the first time, that constituency has a civilian political leader that is independent of the army top brass, right? And that is extremely threatening, because what that implies then is that the, this Leviathan kind of thing that previously existed, and we had this, Pakistan has had economic problems since day one, right? And every few years, Pakistan basically becomes ungovernable, and the military top brass intervenes and establishes, some kind of normalcy, right? That's been the kind of the cyclical pattern. This time around, however, my fear is that things are very different for two major reasons, right? If I may.
Yeah. Why would you categorize this as a fear? Wouldn't is it something that a welcome sign that we're kind of, there's a disruption of the status quo, no matter, the process may not be as, rosy as one would expect it to be, but like realistically, whenever there's a disruption,
there's been disruptions that have been terrible for human history, right? Germany experienced a disruption, a change in the status quo in the 1920s and 30s. We know how that ended. Iran experienced, something in 1979. Depending on how you look at it, the status of political freedoms doesn't look too great to me, to be honest, right? So it's a question of what kind of transformation is taking place. It's not just about, the Taliban could have overthrown the Pakistan army. The issue is not one of, it's never been an issue of, the army was and never will be a monolithic entity. This was just a simplistic kind of a notion that some people had, right? We have these simpleton kind of analyses in Pakistan. It's not like it's 500,000 people. What do you mean, right? It's not one person making all the decisions. We have those characterizations, nor is Imran Khan, by the way. What I was saying was it's a fair for me because of the following reason, right? Number one, it seems very, very unlikely, at least at the face of it, that Pakistan's deal with the IMF is going to go through, especially with the recent, bumping
Of
up
course.
6 to 8 billion.
Yeah.
That's the first fear. Fear number two is that, we're not talking about this enough, at least in the Pakistani media. 80% of Pakistan's interest payments in the last 3 years have not been to the Paris Club countries. They've been to one particular country, namely the People's Republic of China. 80% of the interest payments, right? Now, this is significant because if you think about it from the lender's perspective, right, I know that we like to, we have these rhetorical kind of ways of thinking about the IMF in Pakistan, but if you look at it from the lender's perspective for a moment, right, there's lender A and there's lender B, IMF in China. If I have two lenders and if I accept receipts from lender one and make payments to lender B, obviously that's going to be a structural issue for lender A for obvious reasons, right? Number one. Number two, the fact that Pakistan's army chief a couple of weeks ago went to China, right, and offered greater military alliance. In particular, there's discussion about a naval base in Gwadar, a Chinese naval base. So all kinds of military and strategic compromises have been and will be offered in return for the security of political rents in Pakistan. I don't think the Chinese leadership wants Imran Khan back in power. So that's my biggest fear, that on the one hand, the military's constituency is no longer within the control of the military top brass, right? And on the other hand, the international kind of coalition of interests, because of Pakistan's economic situation, right? You see, political sovereignty is a casualty of economic volatility, right? When you're running out of funds, default should not be an option. For obvious
Absolutely,
reasons.
yeah.
Should not be. It should be a parameter. It should be what we call in economics a binding constraint, right? It's not something that we can play around with. It's not a possibility. So I think that the political chaos is only going to worsen given the confluence of the economic and political factors at this precise moment.
Yeah,
please, Danish.
Yeah. So, and building on this, like land economies is a great point that Shahram mentioned, and he referred to that institutional structure, right? So I would say that particular institutional structure has led to the economic crisis because it leads to redistribution of resources from bottom to top. Like in the case of, for example, land economy, small peasants or landless peasants have been displaced, right? And that land has been used for real estate speculation, right? So in this process, in any development process, or I would say in capitalist development process, there will be some winners and losers, right? So those losers are obviously the ordinary Pakistanis, in particular the small peasants and landless workers. But the winners, the argument is, as long as winners are more than losers, or overall gains for the economy are more, we can tolerate that, right? That's the kind of development discourse. In the case of Pakistan, those winners, as Shahram mentioned, are tied to, again, that elites, right? In particular, the real estate developers and folks inside civil military bureaucracies, and the hegemony of that socio-institutional structure can be measured by the fact that now in Pakistani media, after a while, now you can talk about generals and judges, right? You can name them chief justice, army chief, but at least what I notice in the mainstream media, name of the real estate developer, Malik Riaz, is muted, while the name of army chief and chief justice is not muted these days, right? So this illustrates that socio-institutional structure, because I would argue, because the economic interests of elites are more tied to Malik Riaz, because he provides those rents through his development, or what we call gated housing enclaves, right? So his reputation should be preserved. So this is this kind of reflects that broader institutional mechanism which creates problem. And again, today, if you notice, at least what I heard, there's speculation that Malik Riaz is again the guy to negotiate between Imran Khan and army chief and the PDM. So one would wonder what's about him, right? So we would say, well, because he's the rich guy, he's influential, he's trustworthy. But I wanted to give this anecdote or this example to illustrate that what we are saying, that socio-institutional mechanism is built around land economy, it manifests in this example. Like that's because whole elite network is tied to that land economy, and it leads to inefficient outcomes in a way that it doesn't expand productive capacity of the economy. It does not create decent employment opportunities. And most importantly, the current crisis of current account deficit or the external payments crisis, it contributes towards it rather than addressing that crisis. As Shahram mentioned, the marginal propensity to import is high when you expand that real estate development in Pakistan.
Well, Vanish, you know what? I think you've just you've added extra work for a video editor because we'll have to mute that part. But no, jokes apart, I think I wanted to come to the later half of this program, but I kind of give that disclaimer too, that even the disruptions that we see that are happening in Pakistan at the moment, I don't think they are going to lead to any changes in status quo, because you pointed out that despite regardless whosoever is in power, whether that's PDM, whether that's PTI, whether that's the military dictatorship, they're all governed by one set of power brokers and the land mafias, which dictate the economic environment of Pakistan as well. So if we're talking about from an economic lens, if we're viewing it, we understand that trade deficit, for example, is a huge issue. And again, I don't want to repeat what Shahram said. Trade deficit exists because of the fact that we have not been producing value-added goods that can be exported elsewhere. When the world opened up, when the volume of global trade increased exponentially, we did not capitalize on those opportunities. Rather, we became an import-oriented consumption economy. And the reason being because all of our incentives, I guess it has got all to do with systemic incentives. For example, taxation. If you invest into real estate, if you invest into property design, you're paying 0%. If you want to set up a business entity or corporation, you are paying 29% in taxes. So I guess systematically, there's been a lot of injustice, which has nudged the operators of the working classes, the professionals, or the entrepreneurs in a manner that there's this nation building completely circumvented that notion of investing in businesses, investing in products and goods which can serve to rectify the balance of payment crisis, for example, that we're trying to face. And like rightly mentioned, you can build a house, but you cannot export it. You can't sell it elsewhere. So now I don't think this is unraveling anytime soon. So whether there's a revolution, whether it's not a revolution, even Imran Khan, before he was ousted, he was setting up Ruda, the some development society on Ravi. So these are the same patterns that we see. The people at the top can change, but nothing else. Their operations aren't really changing. So I don't see that unraveling. I don't see the trade deficit going anywhere. On top of that, the two other issues that I wanted to highlight from just strictly limiting ourselves to an economic discussion. The fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit exists because we haven't been able to generate enough revenue from taxation. Our expenses that the government tends to incur have been much greater than the income. That leads to there are actually market filling subsidies. Real estate is one. Then there's sugar subsidies. So on and so forth. They're across the board. There's circular debt. All of that has accumulated fiscal debt. Fiscal debt feeds into, is linked with external debt. Now we have unsurmountable debt. Our production dynamics are not changing. So, then what happens? Like the basic question, I actually met someone 2 days ago. He said, okay, we know what's happening. But what happens then? What happens? Like, that was a very simple question, and I actually do not have the answer to it. Where does it end? Will people die of hunger? Will they be out in the streets? Like, what is the end? That is my, again, the big question in inverted commas.
It's not looking good. It's not looking
Yeah.
good, that's for sure. And you see, this issue of rock bottom a few years ago, when this whole drama began to unfold, as Danish pointed out in his historical sketch, the problem really began to worsen, systematically worsen in 2017-18, right? When sections of the Pakistan army led by former army chief, all these generals from the army, from the ISI, the judiciary, all of these, the top brass was basically supporting one man, right? And that's where the problem really began. They were hell bent on, Pakistan's, look at the growth rate, right? 2013 to 2018. It was on a upward kind of a swing, right? And suddenly the trajectory began to reverse. The Panama case and, what do you call it, barring the sitting PM at the time from participating in politics, right? All the rest of it, that has taken a hit. That has had a debilitating impact on Pakistan's growth rate. And I hate to sound like a neoliberal kind of an economist, but the fact of the brute fact in the Pakistani case, at least, right, is that, I'm a big proponent of the fact that distribution is the primary concern of political economy and economics. But in Pakistan's case, I think that it's growth. We have to focus on growth, right? All of these issues that you're talking about, for example, fiscal deficit, we can't tax people, right? We know this, right? As economists, taxes are a function of a ratio, a fraction of total income, right? Yeah. If you produce peanuts, right, I can tax 70% of that income, but it's still, going to be peanuts, right? A fraction of peanuts is going to be fewer peanuts, right? So we need growth, and growth, regardless of whether you speak to a left-leaning economist or a right-leaning economist, growth depends on investments. There is no other way around it. These can be public investments or private investments. These can be international investments. These can be investments for particular sectors. These can be targeted investments, but make investments. Let's create an investment-friendly environment. If we want to do it, people keep debating about, what's the right path for Pakistan? Should it be capitalism? Should it be socialism? Neither of those has worked in the Pakistani context, right? The key question should be, how do we create the appropriate mix of public and private investments? In the Pakistani case, ideally, these should be labor intensive in the sense that they absorb significant proportions of our unemployed youth, right? For obvious reasons. And they should be export led, right? These three facets should be, part of any successful strategy. And by the way, we don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. We just need to observe in our own region. For example, look at Vietnam, right? It sounds almost revolutionary to say this, that, in 2020, I'll give you one statistic. Between 2018 to 2023, last quarter, China's share of US imports has gone down by roughly 4%. 4%. China has lost 4% of its share of US imports. The question is, which countries have gained, right? Half of this has been gained by one country alone, namely Vietnam. The remaining half has been gained by 5 countries combined: Thailand, Mexico, India, and a few others. Now, the question is, what did Vietnam do? What is so special about this country that was, built on the foundations of war and imperialism in the 1970s and is barely 5 decades old? What did they do? Well, the first thing they did was they invested heavily in their people's education and health. 97%. Why are global companies suddenly interested in Vietnam? Is it because they love those people? It's not that. It's never that. It's about unit labor costs and productivity, right? Ask any trade economist, ask any business person, right? Why did Nike decide to produce its shoes in Vietnam? It has to do with low unit labor costs, number one. Number two, it has to do with what you said earlier, taxation policy, right? Vietnam offers security of rents and profits to its investors. So forget Vietnam. Vietnam is way ahead, 97% literacy. India, right? India is attracting global investments from the number one company in the world, no less, right? Thailand, Brazil, these are all examples of similar low income, middle income, those kinds of countries. We're not comparing Pakistan with France or, Great Britain, for example. We're comparing it with what similar countries have done in the last 20, 30 years. The idea has been very simple, whether we like it or not. I have a critique of and a criticism of, global value chains in Bangladesh, etc., and the exploitation of workers there. But in the Pakistani case, this economist, Joan Robinson, famously remarked that the only thing worse than being exploited by capital is not to be exploited by capital, i.e. being unemployed, right? So in the Pakistani case, capital does not want to produce a profit. Capital does not want to exploit the workers by giving them a job in the first place. So how can Pakistani, I mean, this is my kind of, bone of contention with the Pakistani left as well, right? That, okay, so your struggle is about workers' rights and organizing them for higher wages and all the rest of it, right? Higher wages, the concept itself implies that workers have a job, right?
It's a function of productivity as well, right?
Right. So it all boils down ultimately in the Pakistani case, and I may sound like an extreme revisionist here, there are possibilities of class coalitions between workers and capitalists. It's not like Pakistani capitalists are having a ball out there. I mean, look at any Pakistani capitalist right now, right? Are they serious? Do you seriously think they're making a profit? Why is the Pakistani stock market not reflecting those gains then? So Pakistan is not even an economy that promotes capitalist profits and investments. It's not even doing that. It's designed for a very particular kind of profitability that emanates from controlling the value chain end to end. For example, the Fauji Fertilizer Index, the Fauji Fertilizer Company, is Pakistan's entrepreneurial model par excellence. Control the value chain from start to finish, right? Control the input pricing, Ogra's gas, and control the consumer price. Pakistan's fertilizer sells at 3 times the value of the same bag of urea in India. And then we ask, why are Pakistani farmers unable to produce tomatoes at the same price as Indians? Well, I have news for you. Their input price is higher. And generally speaking, when input prices are higher, output prices are higher, right? It's a simple law of economics. So no matter how we cut it, in the final analysis, Pakistan's political and economic crisis boils down to A, the inability of the state and the society to generate production, high value production, B, generate it on a sustainable basis, and C, generate it at a quality that is of use value to the rest of the world.
Very fair point. And I mean, before Danish will come in, and actually I would want you to come in on a follow-up question that I have. And I'm actually, I feel compelled to ask you this. Prior to 2017, and I do not want to sound that I'm favoring one party over the other or one set of policymakers over the other, because I have critiques for all of them. But you specifically mentioned that prior to 2017, Pakistan was on a growth trajectory. But my argument here would be that while growth is an indicator, as a parameter, it is not all, because was there any structural transformation that happened between, let's say, 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2017? When Nawaz Sharif was ousted, that's one. Shift from low productivity or high productivity. Secondly, any export-oriented sectors were they set up? Did you see or witness a change where Pakistan was capitalizing on greater production of goods worth, value-added goods worth exportation or not? On the other hand, the argument that I have is when Mr. Asst, the current finance minister, he had the policies that he's known for, where he artificially, puts up an arbitrarily fixed exchange rate against the US dollar. And while even a freely floating exchange rate is not the solution, it's not the key, until you have those productive capacities to back, freely floating exchange rate. And whether you have the commodities to good, only then it's going to be favorable. But pegging that, what it has done is that it made Pakistan into a transactional commodity. So the value of money, it artificially increased, it boiled up. So rather than producing goods, a lot of business makers in Pakistan, it was feasible for them to import goods from, let's say, China and sell them in Pakistan because imported goods were costing them less. So it is not that while there was growth happening, the growth was not being led by the production scale, upscale production, or integration of Pakistani, mid-tier, periphery, third-tier companies with global value chains. So the integration was not there. The structural transformation wasn't happening. The focus was still back then completely on real estate. Malik Riaz was still the tycoon. He still is. So, growth itself, and even the reallocation of resources, there was an increasing divide. We didn't see that happening. So, Danish and Shahram both, do you think, was that good? Was that bad? Does that make any difference? Because, I don't.
Yeah. These are fair points, but let me give you one example why it was a relatively better period, right? Given in that particular context, the major crisis at that time, right, was in addition to law and I don't like to say law and order situation. It was actually terrorist attacks every few days, right? Remember 2012, and power outages, right? You cannot have any kind of economy, forget about capitalism, socialism, anyism, without electricity these days, right? So that was the major underlying, I would call it a structural problem, right? It's a that's a major public good that you need, or quasi-public good for any sort of production and even consumption. So they kind of address that issue, right? Again, in the case of Pakistan, there's a local colloquial. If you have to even build 10 marle ki koti, it takes it's a huge logistical, right? Given the kind of society we have, the kind of institution we have, but they did pull up. They did well in terms of building those power plants. I'm just simply saying, just putting them out there and plug into national. Of course, you can go into details like the deals were not good and all of that, but that they address that public goods. And second is through
CPEC, I'm assuming that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, right? Through CPEC and also some other investments. So they sort of address that energy crisis. And that's where I earlier said, throughout Pakistan history, the spells of growth are followed by these external account crises, because growth leads to increase in consumption, because Pakistani growth is consumption-led, right? Not investment-led, as Shahram said, which is key. It's more consumption-led growth, higher consumption, because the consumption is tied to imports in Pakistan, and therefore we end up with higher trade deficit, and exports are kind of stagnated or increasing at very low rate, and that leads to external account crises, or you go to IMF to fill that gap, right? So that has been the overall story. Now, the question is how to address, so if this is, and this has been framed as the major issue, right? That this trade deficit is the underlying issue in Pakistan's macroeconomy. So because you run out of dollars.
Yeah.
So the question is, how can you address trade deficit? One, obvious answer is cut your imports, right? That has been historically the solution. But we know in today's globally integrated economy, what Shahram said, global value chains, your exports depend on imports, right? These are the inputs or the intermediate goods. So if you impose high tariffs or quotas, that will definitely limit your exports. So that is not a viable solution for a long term. You can have short spells, right? Again, Pakistan has short spells of restricting imports, but that cannot be a strategy for long term. So the other is to expand your exports, right? And that's where we are referring to that institutional structure that is the underlying problem, because in any capitalist economy, businesses would like to make profits, right? That's what they are there for, right? Now, they'll invest in those avenues which leads to best returns with low risks, right? Now, I'm sure among to talk to anyone in Pakistan, land has been the easiest way to make some sort of money, right? Or even you build houses and sell those, right? Now, for those businesses, I have nothing against Malik Riaz for pursuing capital, like to make money within that capitalist system. He just knows that system really well. It's the state policies that have incentivized allocation of productive resources from productive to unproductive sectors of the economy, such as the real estate. And that is the key issue. Now, it hasn't been framed like this in mainstream. Now it is coming in. We have been, I think I and Shahram have been writing about this for a while, but now it has become a mainstream issue. I hear even Miftah Ismail often talks in this terms, which is a good thing, is a positive. But still in the mainstream, economic crisis is framed in the accounting terms, right? Just as you said, fiscal deficit or taxation. All of these questions are tied to the productive capacity of the economy. So the solution to address taxation problem, solution to address fiscal crises is to expand the productive base of the economy. And in the short run, you can run fiscal deficit, right? As long as it is if you are the sovereign issuer of that currency, right? So there is no economic constraint or fiscal constraint to the government of Pakistan to build public schools in interior Sindh or in Rawalakot AJK or in Hunza, Gilgit-Baltistan. They can build those schools, they can hire local residents and they can pay them in rupees, right? The problem would be, right? The problem would be, well, that would lead to higher consumption and imports. So again, to close this loop, right, in order to avoid this crisis, you have to expand your productive base of the economy. And in order to do so, you have to re-incentivize capital to come to sectors which add to exports. And in order to do so, that's the necessary condition, not sufficient, is political stability, right? That's the necessary condition. And that's the necessary. And throughout Pakistan history, the political stability has been undermined by the intra-elite fights or rifts, right? And as Shahram said, we have been framing those intra-elite fights in terms of institutions like military versus civilian actors or judiciary, but it might be even the rifts between those institutions have probably led to a lot of instability. If you notice, every October or November, whenever the new army chief has to be appointed, there's instability, right? So that these issues needs to be addressed. In order to do so, there has to be a minimum consensus among all economic actors. And that's where there was a hope in 2008, right? The Charter of Democracy was signed between two major political actors. Again, let me add, despite all their flaws, right? We are not really fond of their economic policies or their political policies on lots of issues such as inequality, gender, religious freedom, and so forth. But yet there was a consensus, right? And that consensus has been undermined through a concerted effort by state institutions through a new political actor, PTI. And now that's almost we are at the ultimate conclusion of that orchestrated move by the establishment to disrupt that consensus, and that has undermined economic development in Pakistan. At least we lost that decade.
Oh yeah, very, very well framed and actually very well summarized. And if I may add, I think enhancing productive capacity also hinges on investment, which hinges on investment climate. And I think it's high time where we start looking at those fundamentals, because I mean, just a week ago, I'm sure you must have read that too. There was this fourth convention of foreign ministers between Pakistan and China, and the Chinese foreign minister, he said that Pakistan needs political stability and needs to rectify. These parties need to sit amongst themselves, reconcile. If Pakistan wants to be, a recipient, a good host of investments coming in. And we're not just talking about foreign investments, even domestic investments, public, whether private, for them to, to have optimal results before even realization of the results, for the investments to come in, just the basic info investments. you need a politically stable environment, which sadly has been disrupted. And my message, I think, whoever I speak with, even people on the ground, is that there is no one Messiah. So we have to get rid of this false sense of hope that any one particular person can change or salvage Pakistan. And there are faults with everyone. I mean, PTI, I wrote a paper and I listed an entire bunch of economic mismanagement actions that they undertook. I mean, they had 5 finance ministers, and barring one, none of them was an economist to begin with. So, they had the plan. They never had a plan to begin with, let alone having a wrong plan. And similarly, people's PPP and PML-N, similar issues. So I guess there is a consensus that there are a lot of grays, and all these stakeholders, these key stakeholders, they need to politically reconcile, chart out a long-term plan, and kind of stick to that plan, because enhancing productivity is the only solution in the long term. Shahram, any final remarks that you may want to add?
I just wanted to say that, so in institutional economics, we distinguish between de jure and de facto.
Yeah, de facto, yeah.
This is very critical, right? And as long as there is a discrepancy between de jure and de facto power, what happens in practice versus what is written in the law, right? As long as there is that discrepancy, no political settlement can take place in such an economy, right? Now, it's fascinating, right? I mean,
it's a huge discrepancy. I just want to say that's a huge one.
And moreover, I mean, as someone who's been, studying this as well as, thinking about it for basically my whole adult life, this link between democracy and development, right? If any, right? I mean, I've been coming to the sober kind of conclusion that, the link, if any, is very mild. What I think what in the final analysis matters is the political settlement itself. For example, right? Is there clarity on the rules of the game? In Saudi Arabia, there is no democracy. It's a completely totalitarian state, but there is complete clarity on the rules of the game, right? MBS's power is completely unchallenged. In China, there is no democracy, but it's crystal clear who's going to be in power. The political rules of the game are set. No one is going to challenge them, right? In our case, unfortunately, we've been unable to, come up with any kind of reasonable answer to that particular question. What exactly are the rules of the game? Which also, by the way, ties in with what Danish earlier said, namely that, this idea that Benazir Bhutto came up with. She wrote this book called Reconciliation right before she died. And the idea was, and its practical outcome was the Charter of Democracy in 2008. And the idea was, it was a very good idea. The idea was that, well, given Pakistan's turbulent political past with, coups and all the rest of it, it would make sense for all the civilians to agree on a minimum framework, namely that we'll, fight this political battle amongst ourselves within the legal and constitutional framework, and none of us will ally with the third force, as it's, euphemistically called in Pakistan, right? Who violated that agreement? That's the key question. Who violated that agreement? And if you really start to ask that particular question, no one violated that agreement. One person who was never a part of it, and one particular party that was never a part of the 2008 agreement, never signed the Charter of Democracy, ended up aligning with, the same powers that be for 1 decade, no less. An entire generation of pro-establishment, individuals has grown up believing that this individual, has some kind of saintly powers, So that is not a coincidence. That's a result of the political catastrophe that's upon us. It's a cause as well as an effect.
And now that is unraveling right in front of us. And I mean, despite what strong beliefs anyone may have, and they have the right to their own opinions and viewpoints, on the economic front, which is an economic reality that the people are living through, they're realizing, and it's only going to get worse. There is no, one particular party or individual, not naming names, but there is definitely no solution. Definitely not without political reconciliation. and going back, especially when you want to completely vie against a complete institution and establishment which has been reigning the country for the last 75 odd years, facilitating the interests over the other. So I guess this turned out to be a very heavy discussion, much more than what I had anticipated it would be. I thought we'll just brush upon key basic issues, chote bahut on the economy.
On yourself, man.
Yeah. No, but fair point. I think it was very crucial and important to discuss that, considering what is happening in Pakistan at the moment, because you absolutely cannot ignore that. You cannot circumvent, the realpolitik of the situation. It calls for diverging into not just the economic issues. Of course, they're just a function, and the great independent variable is the political crisis and the political actors who are in play, including everyone.
On a lighter note, if you may allow to say this,
I think we should finish on a lighter note. Yeah, please do.
It may come to bite me sometime in future. All this digital media. There's one solution I propose, right? And that is Imran Khan ko president bana dein, Shahbaz Sharif Wazir-e-Azam hi rahe, aur Bilawal foreign minister hai. Why? Because Imran Khan likes to deliver speeches, right? He wants to be a global leader, go to UN. Pakistan is nothing for him, right? He thinks he's a global leader, right? So as a president, it's a symbolic, ceremonial position. So yeah, let him go, tour the world, give speeches, talk about Islamophobia. Shahbaz Sharif likes to claim to be a doer, right? A chief executive who wants to get things done. So okay, let him try, give him a shot. Let's do. And again, Bilawal is an emerging. So here's a consensus.
Danish is giving ideas to Asim Muneer right now. Huh?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Again,
a new selection. Huh?
Yeah, it's like it's all going to be de jure. The de facto. We all know what the de facto is. But I think a great solution, any solution which brings all of them together, I think I'd be more than happy to take it. And that is, I think, the one key solution is that sit down on a table. The future of the country, you cannot eliminate whatever proportion of a certain population is behind. Whether you consider them crooks, whether you consider one incompetent, whatsoever. As long as there's certain mandate should be respected. That is the way to go beyond democracy. And I think even when this fight against the establishment, the people who are fighting for it and who are very vocal on Twitter, they need to realize that going up against one person is not the solution. If you want to make a democracy versus a military rule, I guess then it makes sense. But for democracy, then you need to respect all parties all across the board. You can't be having protests in London outside somebody's houses. I mean, it's just beyond chaotic what is happening everywhere. But on that note, thank you so much. It was a great discussion and great learning lessons for me as well, and I'm sure for a lot of others. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.